The hospital cafeteria was louder than it needed to be, as if the clatter of trays and the hum of vending machines could somehow drown out the quiet fear that clung to the walls like invisible fog. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a pale glow on the polished floors, and the smell of reheated soup mixed with antiseptic drifted through the air. Families sat in small clusters, speaking in hushed voices over paper cups of coffee, their eyes carrying the same exhaustion, the same fragile hope. At a small table near the wide window that overlooked the gray winter parking lot sat an old man in a worn gray coat, his shoulders slightly bent, his silver hair combed carefully as if dignity were the only thing he had left to control. Across from him, in a wheelchair that seemed too large for her tiny frame, sat his granddaughter, Alina, wrapped in a soft yellow blanket covered with little embroidered stars. Her cheeks were pale, her wrists thin as twigs, and her once bright eyes now looked distant, as though she were staring at something far beyond the cafeteria walls. In front of her rested a tray with a small bowl of mashed potatoes, a cup of broth, and a slice of bread carefully buttered by hands that trembled with love. She had not touched any of it. The old man's hands were wrapped around his own bowl of soup, long gone cold, but he didn't seem to notice. His entire world was in the small face across from him. A nurse approached gently, her shoes making soft squeaks against the floor, her expression kind but shadowed with concern. She crouched beside Alina, lowering herself to eye level. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "just a few bites. Your body needs strength." Alina turned her head away, pressing her lips together, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her blanket. It was not defiance. It was something deeper, an emptiness that illness had carved inside her. The old man swallowed hard and cleared his throat. "My granddaughter wouldn't eat," he said quietly, as though confessing a failure. His voice carried the weight of 3 sleepless nights and countless whispered prayers. "It's been 3 days now. She just turns her head." The nurse placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, but there was little she could promise beyond patience. Around them, a few people began to notice. A young intern paused near the coffee machine. An elderly couple at the next table fell silent. Even the cafeteria worker behind the counter leaned forward slightly, sensing the delicate heartbreak unfolding in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. The old man reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a neatly folded handkerchief with tiny blue flowers stitched into one corner. It had belonged to his late wife, the only woman he had ever loved, the one who used to sing lullabies in a voice as warm as summer evenings. He pressed the cloth briefly to his lips, as if gathering strength from memory itself. 5 years ago, after the accident that took Alina's parents on a rain-slick highway, he had stood in a quiet courtroom and promised to raise her, to protect her, to give her every piece of love he had left. He had learned how to braid her hair by watching online videos late at night. He had burned pancakes and tried again. He had clapped the loudest at her kindergarten recital, tears streaming down his face as she sang off-key with unshakable confidence. She used to run into his arms after school, talking so fast he could barely understand her, her laughter echoing through the small house that no longer felt empty. And now, sitting in that sterile cafeteria, he felt the terrifying possibility of losing her too. "You used to love Grandpa's dumplings," he murmured gently, leaning forward. "You said they were better than any restaurant in the city." Alina's eyes flickered faintly at the memory, but her gaze fell back to the tray untouched. The old man felt something crack inside his chest. Not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet fracture of helplessness. He had faced wars, economic hardships, the loss of his wife, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of a child refusing life because her body was too tired to fight. He straightened slowly, as though making a decision that required every ounce of courage he possessed. He looked around the cafeteria, suddenly aware of the many eyes pretending not to watch. His pride had long ago stopped mattering. Only she mattered. He leaned closer to Alina, lowering his voice to the softest whisper. "Do you remember the song Grandma used to sing when you couldn't sleep?" For the first time that day, her gaze lifted slightly, curiosity trembling in its depths. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but to him it felt like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. He cleared his throat, his voice dry with nerves. He had not sung in public for decades. Age had roughened his tone, and grief had deepened it, but love still lived in it. The first note slipped out quietly, fragile as glass, nearly swallowed by the hum of machines and distant chatter. It was a simple melody about a little sparrow afraid to leave its nest, unsure of its wings, until it learned that the sky had been waiting all along. The words were old, stitched together by generations, carrying promises of warmth and courage. Conversations began to slow. The intern lowered his tray. Someone reached up to mute the television. The old man continued, his voice trembling but steadying with each line, singing not just with sound but with memory. He sang of warm kitchens filled with flour-dusted laughter, of bedtime stories told under dim lamps, of hands that never let go even when the world felt frightening. Each note carried years of devotion, each lyric wrapped around Alina like an invisible embrace. Her fingers loosened slightly from the blanket. The nurse felt her eyes sting. The elderly woman at the next table clasped her husband's hand. The old man closed his eyes as he reached the chorus, his voice cracking with emotion but refusing to stop. In that moment, he was not in a hospital cafeteria. He was in a small bedroom rocking a feverish toddler. He was in a park pushing a swing beneath golden leaves. He was in a kitchen humming beside his wife as their granddaughter danced between them. When he opened his eyes again, he saw something he had been praying for. A tear sliding gently down Alina's pale cheek. And though she had not yet touched the spoon, hope, delicate and trembling, had returned to the room like the first fragile breath of spring. The old man did not stop singing when he saw the tear fall. Instead, he softened his voice as though the melody itself were made of glass and might shatter if handled too roughly. The cafeteria had grown impossibly still, the usual noise replaced by a heavy, sacred quiet that seemed to wrap around every table and chair. Even the hum of the vending machines felt distant. Alina's small hand moved slowly from the blanket to the edge of the tray, her fingers hovering near the spoon, as if unsure whether she had the strength to lift it. The old man watched without staring, afraid that too much hope might scare the moment away. He sang about the sparrow again, about how it trembled at the edge of the nest, convinced the wind would be too strong, the sky too wide, the fall too far. His voice cracked slightly on the higher notes, but he leaned into the imperfection, letting the rawness carry the truth of every word. Alina's fingers curled around the spoon at last. It was a small movement, almost fragile enough to be imagined, but it was real. The nurse pressed her hand gently against her own chest as if steadying her heartbeat. The elderly couple at the neighboring table blinked rapidly, tears gathering despite their efforts to remain composed. The old man continued singing, his eyes shining now, his heart pounding loudly enough that he could feel it in his throat. He saw Alina lift the spoon, hesitating halfway, her wrist trembling. For a second it seemed she might lower it again, that the effort would be too much, but then she brought it to her lips and tasted the smallest bit of mashed potato. The room released a collective breath. It was not applause, not celebration, just a soft exhale of shared relief. The old man's voice faltered for a moment, overwhelmed, but he swallowed his emotion and finished the verse, each word now glowing with cautious hope. Alina chewed slowly, thoughtfully, as if remembering what food was supposed to mean. Her eyes, though still tired, no longer looked empty. They looked present. When she swallowed, she glanced up at her grandfather, and in that look was recognition of the song of his love, of the countless nights he had stayed awake by her bedside. He smiled at her, a trembling, radiant smile that transformed his lined face into something almost youthful. "That's my brave girl," he whispered between lyrics, careful not to break the spell of the melody. She didn't speak, but she dipped the spoon into the bowl again. The second bite was slightly larger. A quiet sob escaped from somewhere behind them, quickly stifled. The cafeteria worker turned fully away now, pretending to wipe an already spotless counter. The young intern set his tray down without realizing he'd done so, his eyes fixed on the fragile miracle unfolding in front of him. The old man shifted the song into its gentlest refrain, the part his wife used to repeat when Alina was too restless to sleep. He remembered how his wife would stroke their granddaughter's hair, her voice floating through the dark like a promise that morning would always come. For a brief, piercing moment, he felt his wife's presence beside him, as if she were lending him her strength. Alina took another bite, then another. They were still small, but they were deliberate. Color seemed to return faintly to her cheeks, or perhaps it was only the warm light reflecting differently now that hope had entered the room. The nurse stepped closer, kneeling once more beside the wheelchair. "You're doing so well," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Alina gave the smallest nod, her focus still on her grandfather's face as he sang. The old man's hands trembled slightly against the table, but not from fear anymore. It was the tremor of gratitude, of disbelief that something so simple, a song, an old lullaby carried through decades, could reach where medicine sometimes could not. He let the final notes linger in the air before gently lowering his voice into silence. No one spoke immediately. The quiet felt holy. Alina looked down at her bowl, then back at him. "Again," she whispered, her voice thin but clear. The single word felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He chuckled softly, brushing at his eyes with the embroidered handkerchief. "As many times as you want," he replied, and began once more from the beginning. This time, his voice was steadier, fuller, no longer trembling with uncertainty. It carried confidence, like the sparrow who had already tested her wings. With each verse, Alina continued to eat, slowly rebuilding strength one spoonful at a time. The cafeteria remained hushed. Strangers bound together by the quiet privilege of witnessing love refused to surrender. Some bowed their heads, others openly wept. In that ordinary hospital cafeteria, under harsh fluorescent lights and the faint scent of disinfectant, something extraordinary had taken place. Not loud, not dramatic, but deeply human. A grandfather had given everything he had in the simplest way he knew how, and a little girl had answered with courage. By the time he reached the final chorus again, the bowl in front of Alina was nearly half empty. Her breathing seemed steadier, her shoulders less fragile beneath the blanket. When the song ended, she leaned back in her chair, tired but no longer hollow. The old man reached across the table and gently took her hand, pressing it to his lips as tears finally fell freely down his cheeks. This time, they were not tears of helplessness, but of relief so profound it left him shaking. Around them, life in the cafeteria slowly resumed. The shuffle of feet, the murmur of voices, but something had shifted in every heart that had witnessed the moment. Hope, once fragile and fading, now stood quietly in the center of the room, carried not by medicine or machines, but by a grandfather's trembling song and a granddaughter's brave, determined bite. By the time the final note faded for the second time, the cafeteria no longer felt like a place of exhaustion and waiting, but like sacred ground where something fragile had been rescued from the edge. The old man kept holding Alina's small hand as if it were the most precious thing in the world, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles to make sure she was truly there, truly present, truly fighting. The bowl in front of her was no longer untouched. It was half empty, streaked with the quiet evidence of effort. The nurse, still kneeling beside them, let out a soft laugh through her tears and stood to call the attending doctor, her voice trembling with cautious excitement. Word traveled quickly down the hallway that the little girl in room 312 had finally eaten. It was not a dramatic announcement, not something that would make headlines, but inside those hospital walls it felt like victory. The doctor arrived moments later, trying to maintain professional composure, yet visibly moved as he crouched to Alina's level and asked how she felt. "Better," she whispered, her voice fragile but alive, and the old man felt that single word settle into his chest like a warm flame refusing to go out. He had feared silence. Instead, he had been given hope. He reached for the cup of broth and carefully held it while she managed a few small sips, his hands steady now, guided by purpose rather than desperation. Around them, people who had witnessed the moment began to drift back to their routines, but they carried something changed in their expressions, an awareness of how powerful love could be in its simplest form. The elderly couple stopped by their table briefly, the woman squeezing the old man's shoulder and whispering, "Don't ever stop singing." The young intern offered an awkward but sincere nod of respect before returning to his shift, silently promising himself he would remember this day whenever medicine felt too clinical, too distant from the human heart. When the doctor finally stood and assured them that this was a very good sign, that strength could rebuild from here, the old man closed his eyes for a second longer than necessary, offering a silent thank you to a heaven he had questioned many times over the past week. He was not a man who demanded miracles. He believed in work, in patience, in showing up every single day. But this felt like grace meeting effort halfway. Alina leaned her head gently against his arm, her small body tired from the exertion, yet no longer withdrawn. "Grandpa," she murmured, tracing the pattern of blue flowers on his handkerchief. "Grandma used to sing it softer at the end." He smiled through tears. "She did," he admitted. "She always said the sparrow needed quiet to hear her own wings." Alina's lips curved faintly at that, and he realized that the spark in her eyes was returning. Not fully, not brightly yet, but enough to light the path forward. Later that afternoon, back in her hospital room, sunlight slipped through the narrow window and painted pale gold lines across the blankets. The old man sat beside her bed instead of across from her now, humming the melody under his breath while she rested. Machines still beeped, for lines still dripped steadily, and the reality of her illness had not vanished. But something fundamental had shifted. She had chosen to take a bite. She had chosen to respond to love. When she woke again, she asked for applesauce, and though it was only a few spoonfuls, the nurse practically glowed while bringing it in. Each swallow felt like a promise whispered into the future. As evening approached, the old man stepped into the hallway for a moment alone. He leaned against the cool wall, letting his emotions finally rise without restraint. He had been strong for so long, through the funeral of his son and daughter-in-law, through the lonely nights learning how to comfort a grieving child, through the endless appointments and test results. But this day had tested him in a different way. It had asked him not just to endure, but to believe. And belief, he realized, was sometimes the bravest act of all. He wiped his face with the handkerchief and looked up at the ceiling lights, whispering, "Thank you for the song." When he returned to the room, Alina was awake, watching the doorway as if she had been waiting for him. "Sing again?" she asked softly. He chuckled and sat beside her, taking her small hand in his weathered one. This time he sang quietly, just for her, the melody flowing gently like a lullaby meant for one heart alone. She closed her eyes as he reached the final verse about the sparrow finally trusting the sky, and he could see her breathing steady, peaceful. Outside the window, the winter clouds began to part slightly, allowing a sliver of evening light to break through. It was subtle, almost shy, but unmistakable. The old man finished the song and remained there long after she drifted into sleep, his thumb still moving in soft circles against her hand. He understood now that the song had never been about perfection or performance. It had been about connection, about reminding a small, tired soul that she was not alone at the edge of the nest. And as he sat there in the quiet glow of the hospital room, he realized that no matter what challenges lay ahead, more treatments, more waiting rooms, more uncertain days, he would keep singing. Because sometimes healing begins not with medicine, but with memory. Sometimes strength returns not in grand gestures, but in a trembling voice refusing to fall silent. And sometimes, when love is brave enough to be heard, even the weakest sparrow remembers how to lift her wings.